Why me? Why this? Is God no longer in his heaven? Does God not care? How could God let this happen? All of this for nothing? You see, those are questions. Those are comments. Those are statements that many of us make when we find our faith hanging and hinging on the ropes. 3 weeks ago, when we started this series, I gave the analogy of a wrestler or a boxer in the ring. And they've just been banged and beaten up so much that they find themselves hanging on the ropes, ready to throw the towel in, ready to give it up. Sometimes that's where we find our faith. We ask, why God? Why aren't you doing something? Why don't you come to my rescue? Why don't you answer my prayers, Lord? Now, if you really do have a true knowledge and a true understanding of God, and if you're sincere about developing a real, true relationship with God and determined to walk with God, then mark it down, folks. I'm telling you right now. There will be times in your faith when you will find yourself hanging on the ropes. There will be times, even as a strong, dedicated, committed Christian, that you will be manipulated by the waves of doubt. There'll be times when your relationship with God will come down to one word with a big question mark to follow. What? What are you doing, Lord? What are you trying to tell me? Why? Why, Lord? Why is all of this happening? Where? Where are you, God? If you really are that sovereign being that knows everything that's going on in my life and everything that's going on in the world, why aren't you doing more? When are you going to do something? Now, we've been studying the 3 chapters in the book of Habakkuk. I asked you 3 weeks ago, how many of you all had Habakkuk as your favorite book of the Bible? There were no hands that went up. And it may not be, even today. But I will say, I have learned a lot from Habakkuk. From what this minor prophet has said, I've learned a lot about his love for his people and wanting them to do right, wanting them to stay in line and get in line with God. Habakkuk was a man of God. He was a man called by God. He was a man who knew God. But yet he was a man that wrestled with God. Now, in case you haven't been here in the last 2 weeks, or maybe you were here and you were asleep or you weren't focused, let me give a quick review of what's going on in the life and the ministry of this minor prophet, Habakkuk. He lived in the nation of Judah. He lived at a time when there was much rebellion, there was much wickedness, there was all kinds of idolatry. He'd been praying to God, been praying over and over and over again, God, please bring revival to the land. He just couldn't understand why God was seemingly so indifferent. It was like he didn't care. He couldn't understand why God wasn't doing something. He found himself frustrated that God was seemingly inactive and not doing anything. And he even gets to the point there in chapter 1 where he confronts God. God, why aren't you doing something to punish these people here? Why aren't you answering my prayers, praying for my people? But you're seemingly not listening. Are you going to do something? And then finally God does answer. And he says, I am doing something. I'm going to send the most wicked people on the planet to Judah. That'll wake them up. This is a little less wicked than the people of Babylon. But Habakkuk doesn't understand that. And he says, how can you do this? You are holy God. You are a righteous God. Why are you doing this? But God comes back with the reply, I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm doing. I will do what is right. I will do what is best. Now let's just stop for a moment. If God was telling Habakkuk that and what was going on in his day and time, is it possible that he could be telling us the same thing? Reminding us, I know what I'm doing. I'll do it right. Trust me. Trust me. No, this little book, 59 verses, I believe is what I counted. 59 verses in 3 chapters that are so relevant to where we are today as a nation and as a world. We're living in some pretty tough times, just like Habakkuk was. I don't know that I've ever seen so much despair, so much discouragement, so much disillusionment all across our world as we are experiencing right now. When we face tough times, we've got to learn from the prophet Habakkuk. Now he tells us, he doesn't say it in so many words, but if I could paraphrase what he's really doing, you have 2 choices. You can walk down the path of fear and be engulfed in that, or you can walk down the path of faith and trusting God. This message this morning is for anybody that's living in fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of all the things that's going on in the family. There are those that would say, my family's just so dysfunctional. So many problems, so many situations going on. And there are some that are fearful because of their finances. Their checkbook runs out of money before the end of the month. And they're struggling. There are those that struggle with the future. What am I going to do now? This has happened, or this has happened. I don't know what I'm going to do. So there's a sense of fear that can be overwhelming to us. Now, as we get into the 3rd chapter, this is actually a song. You may or may not have known that. But this is a prayer that Habakkuk had prayed, but he had put music to it. And it was sung by the ancient Hebrews. Chapter 1, we find Habakkuk doubting God. Chapter 2, we find him in the midst of a debate with God. But now we get to chapter 3 and things have changed. He's now defending God. He was questioning him. He was doubting him. He was debating him. But now his eyes have come open. And he's telling us, whatever one of us need to do when we find our faith hanging on the ropes, just like that wrestler. I don't know if I can take this any longer. Just ready to throw in a towel. I'm ready to give it up. First thing he tells us, we must have a desire to know and do the will of God. Oh, man. See, I see Habakkuk as having one of those aha moments. Oh, yes. Okay, God, I've stepped back. And here I am. I've been in confrontation with you. I've debated you. I've doubted you. And now the light switch is turned on. Oh, this is what you're up to. I get it now, God. He didn't in chapter 1. See, now he comes to the point where he is forgetting that what he thinks is right and going back to where it all belongs to God. God has a plan. God has a purpose. God has a set of priorities for every one of us. And now Habakkuk is at that point in realizing, I understand. See, he's no longer debating that God has a plan. He's no longer debating God's method of using the most wicked people in the world. Remember the Babylons? I told you last week, I believe it was. They were so wicked. They killed their babies. They raped the women. They were wicked. Considered the most wicked people on the planet. And now, Habakkuk is defending what God is doing. He's defending his works. He's defending his ways. You look at this, you read those 3 chapters. 59 verses isn't too many. Any of us can read that. If the sermon gets real boring this morning, read the 59 verses, okay? But you'll see that the entire perspective of Habakkuk has changed. He no longer wants what he wants. In chapter 1, we saw that, even in part of chapter 2. But now he wants what God wants. His number one desire is that everything that God does, or everything that he does, is in accordance with God's will, God's plan. Because he's realized God really knows what he's doing. God knows what's best. Your kingdom come, thy will be done. That's a pretty powerful prayer. It's part of the model prayer, but it needs to be a part of our lives too. Your kingdom come, Lord. Thy will be done. Now listen, when you want to get to that point, and we're going to look at verse 2, if you really want to get to that point of really knowing and doing God's will, let's see what he says there. Oh Lord, I have heard the report of you and your work. I've heard what you've been doing. Oh Lord, do I fear? In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. And we're going to make reference to that again in just a few minutes. In tough times, we need to renew our remembrance of who God is. We need to renew that remembrance of what God has done and what God can do. Some of you right now are at that point where you're saying, God, I know you can do it, but you're not doing it. When are you going to do it? What can you do, Lord? I know you can. Then let's look at verse 6. He stood and measured the earth. God. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. You see, we'll be able to put our tough times in the right perspective, but only when we get that one essential thing in order. Keep eternity in view. I shared this with the Wednesday night crowd. I walked in Morgan's hospital room at that time. Very first thing I said was, how you doing, Morgan? He says, I'm dying. He knew he was. But he knew it wasn't the end. He knew that there was an eternity on the other side. See, we can deal with some of the problems. We can deal with all the problems if we look at it in the right perspective. You know, I just don't know. I just got to throw the towel in. And I've got people right now I'm dealing with that are ready to throw the towel in. I just can't stand this any longer. But when we look at it in the right perspective, you know, this life on earth is pretty short in comparison to eternity. Our earthly life is just a small piece of God's eternal puzzle. Our ways are earthly. Our ways are flawed. Our thinking is flawed. Our thinking is faulty. But God's ways are always consistent. They're always constant. God's ways are always confirmed with the principles in his word. Romans 8:18 puts it this way. For I consider that the suffering of this present time is not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. God is eternal. God's ways are eternal. Our circumstances, the circumstances around us, they are constantly changing every day. But God is always the same. The same God that created the universe is the same God that created you and me. Things on earth are constantly changing, but eternity never changes. God's principles, God's purposes, God's promises never change. The promises that were written into that book, when it was written, when it was printed, when it came off the printing press, very same promises, principles, and precepts that God gives us today. Now, yes, God may change his methods. God may change his timing. And so often he does. But God is still God. God is still on his throne, and God knows what he's doing. Now, that's why Habakkuk, when we get to the 3rd chapter, is no longer begging God to call off the Babylonians. He's no longer begging God to let him do it his way. There in verse 2, that last part, in wrath, remember mercy. Man, I thank God that he is a God who does just that. In wrath, remember mercy. He was certainly doing that for the Israelites. You know, God is a just God. And because God is a just God, he has to punish sin. But in his mercy, he provides forgiveness. And if you know the rest of the story, then you know that 70 years after the Babylonians destroyed this nation, the people were restored to their land. The temple was rebuilt. I've even shown you pictures of that when I was there 8 or 9 years ago. The wall was resurrected, and the nation came alive again. But that could only happen because people were seeking to know and do God's will. That leads us to the next step. Remembering the works of God. If you're doubting right now, if you're sitting here in the sanctuary, if you're out there in that media world, on that live stream or whatever, and you're doubting whether or not God is really in control, if you're doubting whether or not God is really involved in your life and the circumstances in your life, if you're doubting whether or not God is really awake, maybe he's fallen asleep at the wheel and he just doesn't know what's going on in my life. If you're not listening to him, or you don't think he has the right things for you to listen to, then all you have to do is to look at the past. Go back in your life. Look at the things that God has done. See, we can get so overwhelmed and wallow in our self-pity, all the things that are going on right now, and we forget, we lose focus of what God has done in the past. If you think God is not taking care of you today, then maybe what you need to do is to look back and see how God took care of you yesterday, yesteryear, in days and years gone by. That's what God was doing. In verse 3 there, Habakkuk is referring to that time when God had met with Moses. God came from Teman and the Holy One from Mount Paran. Habakkuk is making reference here to when God had met with Moses, raised him up, and delivered his people out of bondage while they were there in the nation of Egypt. And he's reminding himself, Habakkuk is reminding himself of how God was at work. Even when the people didn't realize that God was at work, God had his plan. God was fulfilling his purpose. And then when we get down to verses 8 and 9, Habakkuk is recounting one of the greatest miracles in the Old Testament. Was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers? Or your indignation against the sea? When you rode on your horses, on your chariot of salvation? You stripped the sheath and your bow, calling for many arrows. Salah. You split the earth with rivers. What does that mean? What does all that mean? Well, when you really dig into that, then you realize that he is reminding and recounting one of the greatest miracles in the Old Testament when God parted the Red Sea so that the people of Israel could pass through on dry lands, and the Israelites could eventually make it into the Promised Land. The Egyptian army was destroyed. We get into verse 11 there, and he's recounting the story of how the Jewish armies were fighting the Amorite kings. The sun and the moon stood still in their place at the light of your arrows as they sped, at the flash of your glittering spear. See, Joshua had prayed for the sun to stand still so that they would have more daylight to be able to have victory over the Amorites. And if you go to the 10th chapter of Joshua, you see that's exactly what happened. The sun stood still, and Israel won one of the greatest victories that they ever had. Verse 13 tells us something that he probably didn't even know. You went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. What does that mean? See, I don't think Habakkuk really knew the full impact of what he was saying and how God was speaking to him and through him. But he's making reference to Jesus Christ, the anointed one of God. And now we look back and see what was taking place then. And Habakkuk was challenged to look to the future, the Christ of the cross. Now, if nothing else reminds us of the God of yesterday being the God of today, then we need to look at what Christ did and how he was working through bringing about a Savior so that he could live and die on the cross for our sins. Now, here's what I think Habakkuk is making, the point that he's making. He is reminding us, he's reminding Habakkuk that God, who has been faithful in the past, will be faithful in the present. He will be faithful in the future. And then, real quickly, we've got to persevere when it comes to our worship and our relationship with worshiping God. I know what some of you are probably thinking. You're sitting there and you're saying, okay, preacher, that sounds good in theory. I know I need to be striving to know and do the will of God. I know I need to be doing this and that. But you don't understand, preacher. You just have no idea. I still don't have a job. I still don't have the money to pay my bills. I still have health issues that I'm trying to deal with. My spouse and I are not doing good. And the list can go on and on and on. But what we see here, Habakkuk is saying, frankly, I'm scared. Got all of this going on. I know, God. I know that you've got your plan. I know that you've got your purpose. But I'm going to be honest with you, God, I'm scared. I don't know what to do. Now, if Habakkuk could tell us anything and come before us right now, verse 16 is what I believe Habakkuk would remind us. I hear, and my body trembles. I hear what you're saying, Lord, but I'm still trembling. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. Get this picture here, okay? His body trembles, his lips are quivering, his bones are rotten. My legs tremble. Yet I will quickly wait for the Lord, for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. The Babylonians here, okay? I don't know that we can really fathom just how scared Habakkuk was at this time. In the Hebrew language, Daniel, you'll probably be the only one that will be able to get to the Hebrew language and look at this, okay? But you can test me on this, okay? It literally says, my bowels trembled. Now, he's cleaning it up right here. But in the Hebrew language, it says, my bowels trembled. That's how scared Habakkuk was when he realized what was about to come down. He knew that the Babylonians were coming to destroy the land. He knew that his nation would be destroyed. He knew that his friends and family would be held captive. And that is, if they lived through it. Okay, there's a lot to soak in right here in these 3 chapters. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty of the truth that we see right here. Some of our great fears, some of those great fears will come to pass, whether we like it or not. For some of us, they'll come to pass. You could lose your job. You could be diagnosed with a terminal illness. You could die a difficult death. You might even suffer pain. But as Habakkuk said here, yet I will wait patiently on the Lord. I will wait patiently. I told you in sermon number 1 of this series, courage is not the absence of fear. It goes much deeper than that. Courage is faith in the face of fear. So, what if? What if the worst really does come true? What do you do? Verse 17 gives us a good response. Through the fig tree, or though the fig tree shall not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food. The flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. Now, you would really have to go all the way back to the economy of Judah to know exactly what's taking place right here, and to know exactly what that devastation would be like. For what they are experiencing or are about to experience, that devastation there is nothing in comparison to the Great Depression. The Great Depression couldn't have began to hold a candle to what they're experiencing there. And the Great Depression would be a lot like Disney World in comparison to what he is describing right here. The economy of Judah was based upon all those things in that list. You got the figs, you got the grapes, you got the olives, you got the livestock, the sheep, the goats, the cattle. Complete devastation. It's not just that the stock market crashed and a few jobs are being lost. He is describing a situation where there will be nothing but complete devastation. Nothing to eat. Everybody is hungry, and death is everywhere you look. In closing, if your number one desire is to be successful, if your number one desire is to be wealthy, your number one desire is to be healthy or to be prosperous, if your number one desire is to have everything go your way, then when things don't go your way, what happens? You won't be able to praise God, as we see Habakkuk doing there in verse 18. But if your goal in life is to stay close to God, if your goal in life is to be at the center of God's will, then no matter what happens, God's going to work it out. Yet I will rejoice. All those things coming down in verse 17. And he says, yet I'm going to rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. Circumstances change all the time. Circumstances of which we have no control over. But God knows what he's doing. God's on his throne. Are we going to rejoice, knowing that no matter what happens, God's going to take care of things? He'll do what's right. He'll do what's best. But even here in this old world, it's just temporary. There is an eternity.